There's one thing I like. It is the history of PFAS.
Yeah, man, you got to get pumped. So, JP, I know you like history. Why don't you share with the folks here a brief history of PFAS testing?
Sure. So the first commercially available method was a drinking water method, method 537. That method included 18 compounds and was superseded a couple years later by a newer drinking water method, method 533, which was a real improvement over the first method in that it uses something called isotope dilution, which we now consider the gold standard for PFAS testing in terms of quality control. Kind of interesting, it includes most of the compounds in 537, but not all of them. And so when the EPA came out with UCMR5, which is in effect right now, they included all of the compounds from both, right? So you've got to use both of these drinking water methods. So those are now the current drinking water methods that are available commercially. Interestingly enough, for the last, up until 2021, we did not have a non-potable method, right?
So what do folks do? How do they get their non-potable samples analyzed?
Great question, right? So what Enthalpy did and what I think every other commercial laboratory did was they would say, hey, client, you'd like to test your groundwater or your wastewater. The only methods we have available are these drinking water methods, so we can't really use those methods exactly as they're written, but we can modify them for you. So laboratories would take the established EPA methods, modify them and validate them right internally and use those to test those other samples, things like groundwater or wastewater.
Yeah. And what kind of challenges do you think that might have given some of the folks having to use those data?
Sure. Well, I mean, created good data for sure, right? But the problem is that when you have every laboratory creating their own modified and validated method, you're going to have discrepancies between the methods, right? Because you've got discrepancies between how different laboratories operate. So it becomes a real challenge when you go back and look at historical data that was created by all these different laboratories and their internal methods, because there was no real standardization across the laboratories.
All right. So now bring us up sort of to currently, what do we got?
I love it. You're setting me up here, Mike. So in 2021, the EPA came out and said, great news. We've got a draft method here for you for non-potable matrices, method 1633. We'd love your comments. And by the way, start using it right now. So it was great because we now had this standardized method that told the laboratories how to handle these types of non-potable samples. And of course, there were multiple drafts that came out as laboratories went through validation with the EPA, and Enthalpy, of course, participated in that. And finally, in January of 2024, the EPA said, okay, we've gone through 4 drafts. We've got our notes. Here's the final method. This is what we will be using. So now we do have a standardized method for things like wastewater, groundwater, sediment, tissue, and biosolids, which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one interesting thing to your point about use it now, different labs would get their accreditation to specific drafts of 1633. And so that's also sort of one of those little nuances of going fast, which was important, get the customers, they needed those access to good methods and standard methods, but it also created a little bit of a back-end problem for the labs when multiple labs may have, some are accredited to draft 2, some are accredited to draft 4, some are now, like us, we're going through our accreditation process again to make sure we're on the final version.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, we did see some of that in the laboratory. We did a lot of work with folks in the treatment technology space, for example, dealing with really nasty samples. And when we had an older draft accreditation, I think draft 2, for example, solids was an issue, couldn't centrifuge them out, right? Couldn't do any phase separation. But with draft 4, we can, right? And so with draft 2, we might see higher limits because we had to dilute things, whereas with draft 4, we can now deal with those solids in a more efficient way that didn't affect the reporting limits. So improvements, throughout the process, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it was a great process to go through, and I'm glad we were able to participate and see the changes as they occurred, and I think we have a better method for it.
Definitely, and I think, the world of PFAS does continue to evolve. We're going to see newer methods come out, I think improvements to this method. One of the things that's interesting about 1633 is that, the laboratories do have latitude to modify the method as long as it's validated, which will allow most folks to optimize the methods and make improvements locally, which is key.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, JP. That was a good overview.
Absolutely, Mike.
And remember, the world of PFAS is forever changing. Stay tuned for the next episode to learn more.